So yeah, thank you everyone again for joining in. So today's session is about data cleanliness for Salesforce. So last week we were talking a lot more about the fundamentals and the background around data importing. And today, going to be talking about some things that you can do inside and outside of Salesforce to try and improve the cleanliness of your data. For those who weren't there last week, I'll just give a brief intro of myself again. So my name is Sam, originally from New Zealand, just down the opposite end of the world from probably everyone in this call. And I worked 2 years as an end user of Salesforce and working in a financial services company, 2 years as a accidental admin, and 2 years as a Salesforce consultant over here in Frankfurt. And then recently, just a couple months ago, founded my own product, which is called DataImporter.io, trying to kind of solve some of the problems that I saw myself and other companies having. So I guess before we get into the practical hands-on kind of stuff, I just thought it'd be good to take a step back and just understand why clean data is actually important, right? So because it's something which, again, end users are generally pretty hesitant towards, resistant to, spending too much time on making sure everything's typed correctly, making sure they're following all the right steps, right? Quite a lot of people typically will just want to get through things as quickly as possible and ignore any steps that they don't see as 100% required. But so these are some of the reasons that I see as most important for why having clean data in Salesforce is really important. So one of them is increased customer engagement. And so what I mean by that is the company I was working at in New Zealand, for example, we had Sales Cloud, we had Analytics Cloud, which is now Tableau CRM, and we also had Marketing Cloud. And one of the issues that we ran into is because some of the data that we had in the Sales Cloud wasn't clean, some of the marketing journeys that we were building in the Marketing Cloud, as well as the reports and dashboards we were building in Analytics Studio, some of the customers were getting kind of lost because the data that we had for them just wasn't clean enough. Now that could have been segmentation data, it could have been email address data, all of that kind of stuff is really important when you're trying to target the right customers. And even just having the right phone numbers, the right email addresses, all of that stuff is really important. There's quite a lot of apps in Salesforce that you can get to actually kind of auto dial phone numbers, right? So for sales reps who are needing to talk with, 100 to 200 prospects or customers a day, they'll often use an auto dialing tool. So if the data in Salesforce is incorrect, then those auto dialers will often just skip over those numbers. Another kind of related one is better decision making. So again, this is more from the end user's perspective. If they're looking at a record in Salesforce and the data isn't clean, or if you've got any kind of automation running, ensuring that the data is recorded accurately and it's up to date is pretty important when you're going to be making either automated decisions or human-based decisions. And the last one is just around user experience and efficiency. And so what I mean by that is the end users, if they're looking at a record in Salesforce and they see a spelling mistake that's been done on an import, or they see, when you've done an import and some data's been lost or the formatting is incorrect, it definitely gives them a bad first impression. So ensuring that they have the best experience possible, that when they come onto a record in Salesforce that hasn't been created by themselves, that it looks clean, it looks up to date, it looks accurate, just makes their workflow a lot more efficient. And by the way, just to mention again, any questions, just feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll get to them. So how can we keep data in Salesforce clean? So one of the ways is there's obviously tools within Salesforce that you can do this with. So some of those are validation rules and duplicate rules, and we'll have a look at some examples of those and some things to kind of watch out for. But you also have access to some tools outside of Salesforce. And this isn't really even just Salesforce specific, but for any kind of data management system is user training. So quite often it seems kind of self-explanatory that you would say, okay, how do you create a contact in Salesforce? And you would think that most people would kind of know how to do it, and most people do. But it doesn't hurt to kind of provide some user training, making sure that they know how to do it the correct way, because as you probably know, there's multiple ways to do things within Salesforce. So providing them some training and some guidelines on how to do it will definitely help you on the way to keeping your Salesforce data clean. And also you can clean the data at the source. And so what I mean by that is data that's not user created. So it's not just like a user going in there and creating a contact directly in Salesforce, but if you're importing from somewhere else, cleaning that data before it hits Salesforce is also really important, because it will save you a lot of time and you don't have to be playing around in Salesforce with dirty data. And then the final point that I would make here is communicate the value and the benefits to all the stakeholders in the business. So I guess the steps that I talked about in the previous slide, all the benefits that clean data creates, is communicate those to all of the people who are going to be using the Salesforce data so that they understand the importance of keeping it clean, and they'll take a lot of that work off you and kind of keep the data clean for you. So one of the ways that you can keep your data clean within Salesforce is to perform data audits. So it sounds a bit technical, but it's actually pretty straightforward and a pretty easy way to get some quick wins with your data. So you can create a report, right, with some information about the business critical data. So if you have certain fields that are used in process builders or flows or for any critical key decisions, you can create a report of those fields and essentially see how users are filling those fields out, if they're fields that users can edit. Right, so if there's a category that a user has to fill out about the likelihood that an opportunity or a lead is going to convert, you can actually have a look in the report and see, okay, this is actually only being filled out on 70% of leads because it's not a required field. Although the workflows that I built are all based around this field being filled out. So I know that there's something not quite working there, or something that we can work on. Maybe it's some training that I have to give the users to let them know the importance of this field. It'll also let you analyze the impact of bad data. So if you've had something go wrong with like a marketing journey or an email that's been sent to the wrong person, this is a good way to be able to see how it went wrong. And from the other side of things, it's also a good way to check for things that are going wrong before they actually happen, right? So if you have a look in your data just by downloading a report, and you notice that there's some fields that are being filled out inconsistently, and you're going to use those fields for some sort of automation or email, that's a good time to kind of get on top of that and correct any errors that are going wrong. And you can communicate those things with data managers. So whether that's kind of the head of customer services managing the end users who are entering this data, whether it's the IT team who are providing you these data imports to do, and that's a good opportunity for you to communicate with them pretty clearly. And then one last step is there is actually some apps on the App Exchange where you can actually analyze field usage. So there's some free apps there where basically it'll install into your Salesforce instance, it'll run through all of your data in Salesforce and tell you on what percentage of records each field is populated. So that if there's a key, and I'll provide you a link to the app at the end as well, so that you can all have a play around with it. But it's really good for basically analyzing how users are filling in records, because you might kind of look at a few examples and say, oh yeah, most of them seem to be filled in. But unless you actually get some facts and figures around it, it's really hard to understand. And it's really good for analyzing new feature implementations as well. So if you've added in a new object or some new fields that you want to be filled in and they're not required fields, then it's a good way to actually understand how your users are interacting with those fields. Cool. So one of the first ways which you can keep data clean in Salesforce, which is kind of available throughout every single object, is validation rules, right? So validation rules are there to ensure that your data is entered accurately. So it doesn't necessarily validate that you're entering data, right? That's more around the required fields, But what you use validation rules for typically is to ensure that there's some business logic being met, there's some formatting of the data that is being met, or some kind of rule that you're creating essentially. And I'll jump into an example in a second and show you how that can sometimes go wrong or be a bit confusing for people. But one point I just want to make is only create them where they're appropriate, right? Quite often you'll go into an org in Salesforce and you'll see kind of 10 different validation rules on every single object. And it's a bit of a maze for the end users to work out how they need to enter stuff, or they'll see one validation rule error, so they'll change something and then another error will pop up, another error will pop up. So it's a bit of a balancing act between making sure your data is entered correctly and the overall user experience. You want to make sure that error messages are clear. So when you set validation rules, you can enter basically a message which will appear to the end users, and you want to make those messages as clear and obvious as possible. You don't want to just say something like, this is invalid, or this value is invalid, or something like that, because that doesn't actually tell the end user what they need to do, right? And again, that's just going to lead to a bad user experience. And then have a process in place where once a quarter, once every 6 months, you actually reevaluate the validation rules that you have in place, because quite often if you might make a validation rule and then you implement a screen flow that users can go through and enter different information. And now everyone's using this flow and the validation rule isn't that relevant anymore, right? So it's always best to do kind of audits of your validation rules as well to see whether they're still appropriate. Has your data structure changed? Are we now getting this data automated somehow? So let's have a look at a validation rule here. Okay, so we have this contact record, which is just a standard contact record, Mr. Sean Forbes, which should be available in any new developer sandbox that you create. And if I go to the next tab here, if I can get the Zoom thing to disappear. Cool. So validation rule. So I've got a validation rule in here for a field called latest data load, right? It's a date field, and I've set the validation up to say greater than today's date, right? So what that's going to do is that's going to evaluate, and if this is true, it'll display the error message that we give down here. So what I've put in here is this must be earlier than or equal to today. And that might seem good, like a good message, right? I've told the user that this needs to be equal to or greater than today. And I've told Salesforce to put the error message next to that field in Salesforce, right? And I've activated that validation rule. So if I go into a record here and I go to edit and I try and put this to 2023, for example, we see we get this error message here saying this must be earlier than or equal to today, which is probably fine, right? It's pretty obvious that this is related to this date. It's telling me that it needs to be earlier than or equal to today. That seems pretty logical. But one thing you need to keep in mind is that when you are running these jobs via a data loader, for example, you won't actually have the same UI as you do as if you're doing it in Salesforce. And I'll show you an example of that. So if I go through and create a contact here, so if I upload a CSV file, it's just a basic CSV with one record, and you'll be able to see that in a second. Cool, it's basically the same data, right? It's got 2023, so that should fail. And I run this job and we see what happens. So if we wait a second, we should get the result, or we could actually look at one of these past ones. We get the same error message, but now, as opposed to knowing that this is related to that exact field, that just says this must be earlier than or equal to today, right? So in this use case, yeah, you can probably figure it out because we've just got one date field. It's a very basic example. But if you're uploading a file which has 100 different fields and 20 different date fields, and the only error you get is this must be earlier than or equal to today, it's not going to be that clear, right? So in that case, I would probably update the validation rule to say, instead of this, to say something like latest data load must be equal to or equal to today, right? It just adds a bit more context. If you run it in the interface, you're still going to get the same message appearing next to the field. So that's pretty obvious. And if you run a job via a data importing tool or a data loader, you're going to get a bit more descriptive messaging. Cool. Required fields are another way that you can ensure that information is entered into a record in Salesforce. It's usually, so there's some default required fields. For example, on contact, you always have to enter a last name. That's always required and you can't turn that off. But you can also set custom fields to be required as well. And the only kind of thing to be aware of here is that you can make fields required on two different levels. One is on the field level, right? And what I mean by that is at a system level, anytime a record of this object is created, Salesforce will check, is this field populated or not? Another way that you can actually enforce a field to be required is at the page layout level. And what that does just means that if you're in the user interface in Salesforce, Salesforce will require that you enter that field, but any uploads via data loader or any other API tool won't actually require that they're make sure that they're required. So one thing to keep in mind there is if you've got any kind of integrations or web to lead forms is a pretty typical example. I was speaking with a consultant the other week who had basically had no leads coming in to the website. They had a web to lead set up where people could go and enter their information in a contact form. Those would be set up as leads in Salesforce. And they noticed that the numbers were just kind of dropped off a cliff. And the reason for that is that added a new required field and put that at the system level, right? But that field wasn't being populated by those web to lead forms. So all of those leads that were being created didn't have that field populated. Salesforce was telling it, well, you need to have it populated, and that was just breaking the system. Whereas what their actual requirements were just when sales reps were creating leads in Salesforce, they needed that information to be filled in because it was specific to the conversation that the person was having. And that's where just understanding the real requirements of the data will help you decide between making a field required at the object level or at the page layout level. Another good example of the page layout level is if you need a field required by certain teams, but not other teams, then you can have different page layouts for different teams and make the fields required on one page layout and not the other. Whereas if you just have it at system level, it's going to be requiring it for everyone. Lookup filters are another one which I don't actually see get used too much. And what they are is you'll be probably aware of lookup relationships. So a common one is like contacts belong to accounts, but you can have it on any custom objects where you can connect and relate two objects together essentially. And what you can actually do is you can add a filter to those lookup relationships. And what that does is if you're on a contact, for example, and you only want contacts to be able to link to a certain record type of accounts, or in this case, I've got some transaction records and I only want them to be linked to a certain security. You can actually set up a filter, and I'll show you in a second where you can do this, where you can actually say, okay, you're only allowed to select certain records when creating those lookup or updating those lookup relationships. And then when you're in the user interface in Salesforce, you just won't be shown any options which are not valid. So again, if I go back to Salesforce here and I look for my custom object, So I go to transactions, for example, and I go to security. So this is a lookup to a different object. And down the bottom, you'll see here, there's lookup filter. So if you go to edit, you'll have the option down the bottom. It's actually kind of hidden, right? If you come on this page, it's just some tiny little text down the bottom that you don't really see. If you click on that, it makes it a bit more obvious. And I would actually kind of like Salesforce to make this a bit more obvious, because it's a good way to help just keep it in people's minds when they're creating relationships. Okay, is there any requirements that it should only be on a certain record type is a pretty common one, or I should only be able to link a contact to an account that is currently active with us would be another example. And so what you would do here is you could add a filter. So you can either add it for the current record. So I'm on the transaction object. So that's why it's there under current record, under the current lookup, or you can also do it for current user or current profile. So you could say, okay, only give me security records where the current user is a system administrator, for example. And you also have the option to write a message. So again, I would advise you guys to customize those messages. Don't just say value does not exist or does not match filter criteria, because it's not really helpful to people. Say exactly what it is, right? Contacts can only be linked with active accounts, or securities can only be, or transactions can only be linked with securities where the value is above $1 million, for example. Cool. Duplicate rules. Another pretty common way of, or a common problem, I would say, in 90% of Salesforce orgs is duplicates come in one way or another. It quite often happens due to a migration from one system to Salesforce, where there's duplicates in the existing system, and that migration is done and duplicates are just in the system. Or another common one is you've got a team of people working on a specific account, and two people will create the same contact, right? And so what you can do within Salesforce is set up something called duplicate rules, which will either alert or prevent users from creating duplicate rules. And so one thing is Salesforce provides you with some standard matching rules or some standard duplicate rules. I would try avoid those if possible, because what's really important here is that you need to define the logic for how Salesforce detects duplicates. And that's going to be completely different from business to business, right? So some examples that I've had of different customers I've worked with, one was a financial institution, and their accounts were essentially households, right? Like families of people was considered a customer for them. And so the duplicate rules that we set up there were based around the address and the last name, in a kind of combination of those two. But for a B2C company that has just individual customers, that's not really going to make sense, right? You'll probably want some combination of like first name, last name, email address, or something like that. So it's going to be different for each business type. And that's where those standard rules just don't really fit in there. One thing to keep in mind is by adding duplicate rules, you're going to probably break some processes. So you want to go into a sandbox, you want to do lots of testing of adding these duplicate rules to see if the new rules are going to prevent something from working. And I'll show you another example of exactly how that can happen. And the final thing to consider is, should you enforce or suggest? So Salesforce basically gives you two options. You can either just tell people, hey, it looks like there's duplicates. Do you want to continue? Yes or no? Or you can actually say, it looks like there's duplicates. You can't go any further. And Salesforce will stop the user from going any further. And the last thing to think about here is how is the data being created? Is it being created in the interface or via a data loader? Because you can run into some issues with that. And I will show you another example of that right now. So I've got some duplicate rules here. This is on contacts, and it's just a pretty basic one. I've got contact first name, is an exact match and the last name is an exact match, right? So first name and last name match, it's going to tell me, well, it's going to assess that record as a duplicate. And the options that we have here, these are kind of the two key ones, action on create and action on edit. You can either set it to allow or block. If you set it to block, it'll mean that that action can't be completed. So you either can't edit a record or can't create a record. I have it on allow. And then on the right here, I've said I want it to alert me and I want to be able to report on these records on create and edit. And I'll show you an example of that now. So let's say I put this back to 1900, so it passes the validation. And I update it to Sean 4, for example, right? There is no other Sean 4 in the system, so that passes. If I now go to Sean Forbes, there's already another Sean Forbes in the system. So you can see I've got the warning message that's popped up here. This record looks like an existing record. It's quite cool because you can click on view duplicates and it'll show you the different records, right? So if the user wants to do a check, oh yeah, that's right, I actually created this contact last week, or oh, okay, my colleague has actually created this one for me. Or it's here from 10 years ago when we tried to contact them in the past. But whatever the case is, the end user can come in and have a look here, assess whether it actually is a duplicate or not. And one thing which I think Salesforce doesn't actually make that clear is if you just click save again, then it goes through, right? So it gives you a warning message, but if you just click save again, it'll actually go through because I've set those rules to allow, right? So that seems good. Again, it seems like a pretty good use case for the user interface. If I set it to block, and I can show you a quick example of that. So if I put this to block and click save and go back to the same contact record, and I'll put it to 4, for example. And now if I go back to Forbes, we get the same warning message, right? Similar record exists. I click save, and now I get an error saying you can't save this record because a duplicate record already exists. So that's just something to be mindful of as you can encounter these errors. One other thing to be mindful of is duplicate rules often interact slightly weirdly with any processes that you have running on. And to show you that, I've created a basic example. So let's say I put this to allow, right? I'm going to allow people to create duplicates. I'm going to warn them. And what I'm also going to do is I've set up a process builder here. Now you'd probably do this in a flow going forward, but this is just a basic example. Every time a contact is created or edited, I'm going to update the contact and make sure that the owner ID is the related account owner ID, right? It's a pretty common use case, ensuring that the account ID, the account owner is always the same as the contact owner. And I've got my duplicate set to allow. If I go through now, I'll just refresh the page so that it knows what it's doing. If I try update it now, Forbes, it says it looks like there's a duplicate, and you click save. That won't work because that's how demos always go. But quite often what will happen is, that's because I didn't activate it. Missed a critical step there. Perfect. So let's give that another test run. So if I go back to Mr. 4 again, and just to show the same thing, we go to Forbes, we should get the warning message, and we do, and we click save. There we go. We get this beautiful looking error message, which says we cannot save this record because our process failed, and the error is duplicates detected, right? And you might think, well, that's weird. They just told me that, you know, the user just said, okay, I know it's a duplicate, but I want it to create anyway. And what's basically happening is in the interface, the user is saying, okay, proceed. I don't care about duplicates. It saves. And then in the background, the process builder is then after the fact trying to update that record again. And because in the backend, there's no option for the user to then accept that second update, the process basically breaks, right? So it's just something to be mindful of, is that if you have any process builders, flows, workflows, any of those things, that you just test them to see how they interact with your duplicate rules. And then another example is in doing a data upload again, you can run into a similar error. So again, you get the option here in Salesforce to update the text that you show to the users. And this one here just says use one of these records, which is the standard text for all duplicate rules. And that doesn't really make too much sense to me, because you can sometimes have multiple different duplicate rules on the same object, right? For different scenarios or different record types, for example. And if you go through and create a record in Salesforce using the data loader or using any other kind of import tool, for example, and I'll show you an example of that here. So if I go through and I'm going to insert contact again, remember I've got the duplicate rules on allow, right? So you would kind of expect that it would go through and work. So we've done our mappings there. We've got first name, last name. We're looking up the account using the name relationship here. Preview. So I've got this latest data load at a date that will pass. And I've named it Sean Forbes here. So it should come up as a duplicate, and I go submit. And we wait for a second. It shouldn't take too long. So I guess from a general common sense point, you would think it should pass because I've told it to allow duplicates to be created. But what we get back from Salesforce is just this annoying error again, use one of these records, ? And again, it's because the records are being created in the backend side of things, if you like, via a data loading tool, that there's no interface for the user to say, choose this record or pass and create the duplicates. So these are just some things that you should keep in mind when creating duplicate rules, is that although it might work on the interface, you want to think again about any data importing that you're going to be doing, any kind of integrations that you have set up, right? So the same thing would apply to those. If you have a lead form on a website where people can fill in information, if there's a duplicate or Salesforce recognizes it as a duplicate by the rules that you've set up, even if you've set it to allow, if you've got this alert thing here, then it's going to break it basically. So you just want to fully assess the impact before implementing these duplicate rules. Like, it seems like a really quick win to keep data clean, and it is. There's just a bit more to it than just simply making a rule and clicking activate. You just want to, again, fully test things. Cool. Another thing that you can do, which I find pretty useful, is, which I mentioned earlier, is trained users. And what I mean by that is not sit down and hold their hands and show them how to click a mouse and type on a keyboard. What I really mean by that is make it really obvious to them what data is important to be entered, right? And so one way, which we've talked about already, is by using required fields or using validation rules. That's a kind of system way of doing things. But some things you just can't system validate, right? So like call notes is a pretty common one. You can't really, it's kind of like a long text field. There's not really any validation you can do on that data apart from making it required, for example. But I've seen it before. You can make a field required and people will just come in and type ABC and click save, right? And Salesforce doesn't know that that's not valid data. And yeah, you could try and create some sort of validation rule to say it needs to be at least a certain length or anything like that. But it's basically just going to annoy the end users, right? And you want to kind of avoid that or find the balance, as I like to describe it. And one way of doing that is just providing them some training to say, hey, look, there's this field on the call notes. It's a free text field. We'd really like you to fill that in because maybe in the future, we'll look to do some kind of analysis on that field, or we have a KPI where we're going to measure basically how often that field is being filled out as a company, right? And so you kind of put it into a measurable quantitative thing so that instead of just saying, yeah, we want you to fill it out, you can actually show them, okay, here's some common examples of some really good call notes that have been filled out. And here's some ways that we're going to basically be measuring this going forward. And so that ties into the next point here of establishing data quality metrics. So if you're an admin at a company and you're working with the head of client services, for example, you can establish with them some data quality metrics that I guess align with the business's goals and objectives to say, okay, we want to be able to contact 75% of our leads with accuracy, right? Or 100% or whatever it might be. And if you don't have clean data, you're not going to be able to do that. And again, you can use validation rules, required fields, duplicate rules to kind of do some things at a system level. But like we've kind of seen, some things still need some user input, right? So if you establish some actual metrics that you can test and analyze, that's a good way to kind of go about that. Ensure externally managed systems match Salesforce. What I mean by that is if you've got any integrations, so again, a pretty common one is like a lead form on a website, or if there's any IT data which is being kind of automatically fed into Salesforce, that you kind of make sure that the users that are responsible for that, so it might be a marketing department, might be advertising, understand the value of having that data coming into Salesforce in a clean way. So you might be able to talk with people who design and manage the website to make sure that they can add some validation of JavaScript on the front end of the website, right? Just to make life a little bit easier once that data comes into Salesforce. And the last thing I would just say on that topic is share your knowledge and document. So you might be, an expert on data cleanliness in Salesforce. You've set up all your duplicate rules, your validation rules. And if you go on holiday or you get unwell or you leave the company or whatever it might be, if you're the only person who kind of understands how it all fits together, then that's a really quick way for everything to go wrong while you're away, right? Or if you're kind of running a monthly data audit and you're away for a period of time and no one else knows how to do this data audit, then that's pretty quick way to have the quality of your data just going down. So make sure you share your knowledge with other people. So that might be another kind of person in your team. It might be some person in the client services team or customer support or whoever it might be, someone in the IT team, and document what you do, like the steps that you take to kind of regularly check the data, analyze it, keep it clean, so that in the case that you're unable to do it, that someone else can kind of take it over for you. Understanding source data is a really important one. So if all of your data is literally just being entered directly into Salesforce, that's not going to be particularly relevant. But I would say in most cases, you're getting data from some external source at some point in time, right? Whether it's a migration from another system, whether it's an online lead form, whatever it might be. But once you understand where that data comes from, it'll help you know where to enforce rules and cleanliness rules so that the data is clean once it comes into Salesforce. So again, if you're running like a web to lead form, you can enforce some validation as the end or as the customer's entering that data into the form. Or if you have a IT system, right, which is storing data and sending that to Salesforce, you can maybe perform some validation on the IT side of things to make sure it's not clashing with whatever rules you have in Salesforce. Because anytime you create a rule in Salesforce, like a validation rule, if that field is being given to you by somewhere outside of Salesforce and the validation isn't in the external system as well, then the rule's kind of pointless because the source data isn't going to match what you have in Salesforce. So what I try and suggest to people is to deduplicate, format, clean the data before it actually hits Salesforce, right? So I kind of focused more on the within Salesforce tools. But yeah, if you can, it might not be your responsibility, but you can at least communicate that that would be beneficial to the company to clean the data before it actually hits Salesforce, whether it's just in Excel, whether it's in the external system, whatever way you can do that basically. And again, the final point, which I will kind of repeat over and over, is just if you import messy data from a source system, it's going to hurt the user experience within Salesforce because people will kind of doubt your ability to maintain the system, if you like, And as users are clicking through different records, if they notice that there's stuff missing, or this isn't like how the old system used to be, is a pretty common pushback, then that's not going to be great for user experience. Testing any updates to processes. So I kind of showed this one already with the duplicate rule and the process builder kind of clashing. But that's where having a sandbox that is up to date with an accurate data model is really important for testing. So ensuring that you actually have complete and accurate data within your sandboxes that you're doing your testing in will make sure that any deployments that you do are actually going to work as expected. Quite often I will see, you'll have a sandbox, you do a test in there, but some processes aren't active in the sandbox, for example, or you don't have related records in a sandbox, but you do in production. So just make sure that you're testing with as realistic example as possible. And again, I've kind of showed this in a few different ways, but just understand the impact of user-created records versus API-created records. So we saw some examples of validation rules that make, full sense by records created in the user interface. They were down by the field. The messaging was pretty clear, but as soon as you do a data import, it doesn't make too much sense anymore, right? So you want to find a balance, or if possible, even better, a way that it works for both, right? It's not too over descriptive for the user. It's not kind of 3 sentences long that they have to spend too much time reading what's going on. But that if you are doing a data import or there's some external service which is breaking, they can also understand what's going wrong. You can utilize third-party tools. So again, I would always recommend having a look at the App Exchange. There's lots of free tools in there that you can use as well to kind of help you out. And among lots of other things, some of the more common ones are around deduplication or merging. So you can kind of set up duplicate rules in external or in these apps as well. And the interface is a bit nicer than the standard one. You can perform automatic deduplication or merging, and those are available to you, as well as other things like data enrichment. So if you have incomplete data in Salesforce, you can kind of populate that automatically. There's data loading tools, which will help you kind of detect some of these issues before they happen. And if things go wrong, again, give you options to kind of undo them, as well as data validations. You can build a bit more complex logic, cross-object validation and things like that. So the Salesforce App Exchange is kind of like a gold mine of tools to help you guys out. Cool. And just so a summary, I guess, of what we've talked about today in terms of cleanliness. Yeah, important to understand and communicate the benefits of clean data. Again, with like lots of things with data, it's not really something that the end user is going to be overly excited about when you tell them the importance of clean data. But if you can kind of put it into a measurable way, then that goes a long way to helping you communicate the benefits. Use the built-in tools effectively and appropriately. So don't overuse data validation tools like validation rules, because it'll just decrease the user experience too much, and make sure you are keeping messaging clear. Dirty data in will lead to dirty data out. So if you're not cleaning your data before it comes into Salesforce, there's only so much you can do from within Salesforce itself. So I would always advise, again, try and clean the data before it gets into Salesforce. It'll make your lives a lot easier. Third-party tools are available. Again, often there is free versions or completely free tools that you can use to perform lots of these tasks. Like merging records, for example, is a pretty common one, where if you've done a big import or a migration and you have thousands of duplicates, it can be kind of a nightmare. And as the way that Salesforce is moving, you could write some trigger or something like that to kind of do it all for you. But that's probably not the easiest way, right? Spending your time building a trigger to clean up a mess that was preventable in the first place. And there's third-party tools that can kind of save you a lot of that hassle. User errors can't always be prevented, so don't over restrict people, because people will always find ways around things. If they don't want to enter data, they probably aren't going to. If you've communicated to them the benefits of it, if you've set up appropriate validation rules and required fields, there's probably still going to be ways that they can get around things. That's where doing those audits and analysis of your data is really important. And yeah, that's kind of a summary of how you can keep and maintain clean data in Salesforce. I'll have a look through some of the questions that we have in here. That's a good question. Can you have the system question or block the ability of user to create duplicates based on the strength of that presumption? E.g., 80% certainty versus 95% certainty. No, so there's no default way to do that. One way which you can kind of fake that is by creating different duplicate rules. So let's just say a basic example would be first name, last name. I'm 50% sure that that's a duplicate, right? So what you can do in that case is you could create that duplicate rule, set that up as allow, so that will notify users, but it will let them go through the stage. And then if it's first name, last name, date of birth, and email address, then you're going to put that as close to 100%, right? In that case, that duplicate rule, you could set that up to block, and then you'll never get duplicates in that way. So there's no way where you can kind of, or at least through the default settings, where you can kind of, give a probability and it'll work that out for you. There's potentially some of those apps that I talked about on the App Exchange that can do some of that stuff for you, like have some sort of AI capability to kind of work that out for you. But in the standard interface, though, but there's some kind of ways you can get around that. Cool. Laurie has a good question. When you document your processes, do you keep them in the files? I'm guessing you're meaning like files within Salesforce themselves. No, I typically don't. And the only reason I do that is sometimes some of the people that these processes are really important for don't actually have or actively use Salesforce, right? So if we're thinking about some of the documentation might be around data analysis, data validation. Some of the people that could be really important for are like IT people, and some of them might not actually have access to Salesforce itself. So I would tend to keep it in some sort of like file sharing system, like a OneDrive or SharePoint or Google Drive or whatever your company kind of uses. And then for any like just Salesforce specific stuff, so like user training, for example, is a pretty good one. I would definitely put that within Salesforce. And another cool thing which I've seen companies do is they'll have like chatter on everyone's homepage. And whenever there's any like new documentation, new feature, you can create a chatter post, kind of send it out to everyone. And then every time everyone logs into Salesforce and they go on their homepage, they basically have like a chatter feed on the right with any updates. They can have links to documentation and that kind of stuff. I guess as Salesforce kind of builds out its integration with Slack, I would expect that in the kind of next few releases, there'll probably be some easier ways to kind of send out messages from within Salesforce to your whole chat, to a specific channel. So you might have set up a Salesforce user channel and you'll be able to post files there. Hi, Samuel. Why and when should we choose to use DataImporter and not the data loader? Well, obviously, my very non-biased opinion, I would say always. But no, to be honest, if you've got like a really basic import or update or export and there's no kind of cleaning you need to do, you've got, you don't have any like complex relationships that you need to use, and your data is pretty clean, you're pretty confident that it's going to work, it's not a large amount of data, then I would probably just go for the standard data loader, right? And that's what I recommend to people. Is it's pretty straightforward to use. Like the interface is kind of designed the way it is to be easy to use or to be simple. That's why you won't see kind of new features being added to it. one thing is obviously it needs to be downloaded on people's computers. So if that's not allowed by some IT departments, then that might be an issue. And why might some people choose DataImporter? So some of the reasons would be that they want some of the, I guess, extra features, like being able to undo imports, being able to schedule jobs that need to be run regularly, to do like automatic backups, for example, to be able to connect directly to ShareDrive, OneDrive, all of those kinds of things. Yeah, that would be the difference. But I would say for like basic, you have a CSV file that someone's given you, it's clean, you're just inserting basic records. Data loader is probably the way to go there.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Any other questions? No, otherwise, thank you, Sam, again. So we have one more in the series next Monday, same time, same place. So thank you guys for coming out today. I know Mondays can be a little hectic and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. See you guys next week.